Thank you all for being here today. My name is Spering. I'm the founder and CEO of Stylinity. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how you can use influencer marketing to drive revenue for your companies. Just a little background. I started Stylinity a little over 5 years ago. We saw an opportunity to work with brands to capitalize on some of the developing trends in terms of people sharing content on social media, selfies, bloggers, all those kinds of things, and leveraging that to drive revenue for brands who wanted to make better use of all that stuff. That technology was obviously pretty nascent. It's evolved a lot since then. Our business model has as well. But in the process, we've learned quite a bit about influencer marketing and how to work with companies to turn that content into actual revenue and to drive that process, make it a much bigger part of your brand. Historically, that hasn't necessarily always tied completely into the affiliate space, but we see a big opportunity within the affiliate world to kind of connect the dots a lot better for brands that are increasingly spending money on influencer marketing. The way we do this is largely through our platform, Go2Buy. So Go2Buy is essentially a content creation and dissemination platform that allows you to also track everything. So there are lots of moving parts if you're trying to run a campaign and work with influencers. Managing all of these pieces tends to require a lot of human labor and time. Generally some expense, lots of things fall through the cracks. And so we've built a platform that makes a lot of that much easier, much faster, much more efficient, which ultimately translates into more revenue, better ROI for our clients. And that's done through Go2Buy, which is, again, the platform for which we have some patents for all the tech pieces that tie this stuff together. So just briefly in terms of the agenda, we'll go through what influencer marketing is, some stats about it. Some of the things we've learned as we've been in this marketplace, some of the best practices around that, kind of where we see the market going. We'll go through a couple of case studies, and then we'll get to some Q&A. So if you've paid much attention, you know influencer marketing is really growing very, very rapidly right now. It's a term that probably most of you hadn't heard 2 or 3 years ago. Now it comes up in conversations all the time. I've historically had a hard time telling people what I do. Now I say influencer marketing, and there's this nod of recognition that certainly didn't exist just a few years ago. But essentially, it's any time you're leveraging users, content creators like bloggers, people who have large Instagram followings, and leveraging them to try to get word out about a brand. Whether or not that's intended to drive sales, it still sort of falls under influencer marketing. But we see really a trend towards measuring all of this and using it to actually create revenue for a brand to drive ROI. So one of the reasons that this is growing so rapidly is that a lot of the traditional advertising has become less effective. If you look at any of the eye tracking studies, you'll see people are really good at avoiding ads. And we're even seeing that the ads that are kind of working are tending to look more and more like the kind of content that's created by influencers, less like the traditional stuff. iPhone, I was driving back into the city last night, and going through, I guess, the Lincoln Tunnel, there's this huge thing with all the iPhone pictures, right? So they're marketing their own product, but using something that's essentially kind of user-generated content. It's people actually use their iPhone to take this stuff, and they're spending money to advertise with that rather than some kind of professionally produced thing. And there's a big trend in that direction. Brands are increasingly spending money on this. These numbers are going to just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This is going to probably be one of the driving trends in our industry for the next at least 5 years. One of the reasons this works so well is that it is native, right? People are spending a lot of time on their cell phones, tablets, computers. They're going on social sites, and being able to reach them kind of where they are is a lot more effective than a lot of the more traditional means. The ROI for it can be excellent. We're seeing 6 to 8x ROI. We've, as a company, experienced even better for our clients in many cases. Certainly it's about matching everything, getting all the pieces to work together, but it is quite profitable, much more so than a lot of the other activities in which companies traditionally engage. It also allows you to reach your audience, again, where they are. Each of these mediums has kind of a different efficacy or different strength. So Instagram can get you in front of a whole lot of people, but probably not generally going to drive quite the same level of conversion. Blogs are probably king when it comes to conversion. You've got a much more kind of dedicated audience. So we like to kind of mix these things together in an appropriate way for the brand, depending on what the objectives are. But they each kind of have a slight stronger points depending on where you're going. And it's also worth keeping in mind the kind of content you create doing this can also then be used as ads, so it allows you to kind of test something to see how effective it is before throwing additional marketing dollars behind it. Among the other things we've learned about this market, the people who are engaging with this influencer-created content, social content, before they ultimately go on to make a purchase, they're more likely to make that purchase, but they also tend to spend more when they do. And probably more important than all of that, they tend to be more loyal consumers. So they're not just making this kind of one-off purchase. They've actually already sort of built an identification with the brand. They're likely to stick around, which means that the customer lifetime value of that person is actually substantially higher than someone you reach through more traditional methods. Now, if you've gotten into this at all or you've worked with companies that have, you'll learn that there are a lot of challenges to getting this done right. So we've seen all the news recently about fake news. You see the same thing with social media, like a tremendous degree. So there's lots of fake followers, lots of fake comments. There are all kinds of bots and automated things that kind of muddy the waters, make it hard to get clarity around what's actually working or the level of influence somebody has. It's a new enough market that a lot of times influencers don't know how much to charge to create content. Brands don't know how much to pay. So often you end up seeing people overpay for something. A lot of times things aren't getting delivered on time. This ultimately comes down to people. As a company, we're trying to leverage the tech layer as much as we can to minimize human error, but there is still a lot of human error, and that creates a lot of problems. There's also issues around kind of inconsistent content in the voice. Getting things to be on brand and really align with the brand's message can be a challenge as well. Tied to that, and also tying into that ROI piece, because there's so much back and forth by the time something's created, so many hours that humans spend doing this and so much that falls through the cracks because people aren't necessarily on top of everything. These negotiations take time. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't get done right. There's a lot of back and forth communication. It's worth remembering, brands are paying their employees to work on these things. All the hours they spend sending an email that probably could be automated, that time also translates into dollars. And then after all this is said and done, for the most part, it's difficult to measure and prove ROI. That's actually really where I see the affiliate piece fitting in very well here. We'll get to that in a little bit. But you want to develop those metrics that are going to allow someone to say, hey, we spent money on doing this thing, and we made a profit as a result of it. And there aren't a lot of things you can do that with in marketing. Ultimately, this is actually the biggest pain point identified by brands, that it's really hard for them to measure and prove ROI. But we think that that's going to be changing significantly in the next 2 years. Despite those challenges, brands are spending more and more every year on influencer marketing. These numbers are going to keep getting bigger and bigger, faster and faster. Your typical campaign now is 25 to 50K. That number is going to continue to go up, as is the frequency with which brands are running these campaigns. Typically, when you're working with a third party to help facilitate these, they charge 10K and up in order to do a campaign. We don't have that minimum at Stylinity because we kind of like to help brands get their feet wet, but that's usually what you're going to come across. In terms of some of the challenges, this is usually a very manual process. Humans, again, working on it for many, many hours. The teams tend to be pretty disconnected. All this stuff sort of evolved in silos. So the affiliate side tends not to have that much interaction with certain marketing people or PR people who are typically having the interaction with the influencers. We want to see that consolidation, or these teams start to work together, because that's going to be an important part of making things work well. But as the affiliate side, you can kind of be the heroes in this and bring this to the appropriate people and ensure that you're ultimately going to be able to help better track and measure ROI, which again is really where this whole thing's going. And that's really a big part of that integration piece. So, very few companies feel they have this stuff integrated. You probably work with a lot of companies that still have separate offices for e-com versus retail, if they still operate both. Historically, the silo effect has created all kinds of issues, and influencer marketing is no different. So in terms of some of the things we've learned, really a lot of getting this right comes down to transparency. So you want to have transparency between the brand and the influencer. It's often good to have a third party in there who's sort of can help mediate that, make sure everything's working smoothly. But really end to end, you want everyone to know what's expected, what's going on, have insights into everything. Plus, the better your data, the better you can optimize things going forward. This is definitely a kind of iterative thing that companies are going to get better at it as they measure things, as they improve upon all of their statistics. But you have to be able to measure it first, and that requires transparency. You want bloggers to disclose as much as possible. Again, you're going to run into a lot of fake information. Hopefully that'll slowly change and everything will get a little more transparent, but that is often going to be a roadblock in the beginning. Brands have to be very upfront in terms of what they want. Getting stuff on brand certainly requires the brand is transparent about what their objectives are. But you also want to be upfront about what the KPIs are. You can do influencer marketing. It's going to be brand awareness, comments, clicks, whatever, or you can focus on ROI. But there are lots of different things, and influencer marketing kind of spans the full marketing funnel. So there's definitely top level stuff, but there's also end user conversion stuff, and you want to make sure you're focusing on the right KPIs based on a campaign. It's also important to make sure that you have again these right KPIs in place, that they've all been agreed upon ahead of time, so that you don't have any confusion after the fact saying, hey, this didn't get done right. That's also going to tie into the kind of influencers you want to engage. Generally, you want to approach that as sort of a long-term process where you've got people who are working with you, off the bat, but that you're sort of paying attention to who works and then trying to replicate that as much as possible and build a relationship with them. Because again, it's sort of, if you're looking at top of the funnel initially, when you're reaching, their followers, if their followers don't know who you are right off the bat, that first engagement is probably not going to translate into a sale, but that third, fourth, fifth engagement might, and that's where you want to have a sort of long-term approach to how you engage both the influencers and that end user. And again, KPI should be unique to the campaign. You want to think ahead in terms of what you're trying to accomplish each step along the way. We think, obviously this is central to what we do, but that there should be a lot more automation in this process. There's lots of time wasted on checking to see if you're sending clothes to an influencer to take pictures, did they get the package? Did they get stuff done on time? All those human pieces have potential for error, potential to waste time, potential for lack of follow-up when it's appropriate, and a lot of that stuff can be automated. So we're, again, expecting to see this market increase massively, more money spent on especially Instagram, but also on blog-related influencer content. Most brands are looking to really improve lead generation and sales conversion. So again, that movement towards ROI rather than this just being purely top of the funnel stuff, it's moving towards that actual conversion at the end, which again is where the affiliate piece fits in so nicely. We also see technology increasingly streamlining this process. Our focus as a company over the last 6 months has been overhauling our platform to make this as streamlined and as efficient as possible, because ultimately you can get better ROI if you spend less time on all the little mundane details and more time on the things that actually work and drive conversion. We expect anyway to see some of these silos shrink or at least sort of develop cross-coordination between them. Ultimately that's absolutely required for this to become as effective as it can be. And as that happens, it's going to become a bigger piece of the overall marketing strategy. So if you think about it, you're able to create content that can sell something on its own because it's got a built-in audience, but you can then use that on a website and a billboard, on whatever, on an ad through all these different networks to drive additional sales. And you can tell what works from the stuff that you've created initially. And a lot of this content is better than what most companies are producing in-house. And so making that a big piece of the overall content strategy, brand strategy, marketing strategy allows you to really leverage some of the stuff that you're going to create in the process of running campaigns and working with influencers. So we'll get into a little bit of our experience with working with some clients. We've worked with a lot of big brands. Obviously, our focus is mostly on like fashion, apparel, lifestyle, accessories, things like that. But ultimately, this is applicable just about to virtually every industry. So we did a campaign with Steve Madden. This was kind of more top of the funnel, but to try to drive awareness of the brand, engagement with end consumers, also get their feet wet working with us. We wanted to also create really good content that would, that they could potentially use for other purposes. We were working with influencers who had obviously the right kind of feel for the brand. It's much easier to work with the right person and get the right result than it is to work with the wrong person and try to steer them towards it. At the end of the day, similar to transparency, having content that's really authentic. You don't want to ask an influencer to produce something that they don't actually believe in. You don't want that misalignment. More things go wrong. If you get the right people, they'll make the right content. But through the campaign, we were able to drive really a lot of engagement at a very, very low cost. The conversion rates were excellent, and also the social impact of all of this was as well. We worked with another brand, a very large fast fashion retailer. Again, as with many things, if you're a household name, it's a lot easier to drive conversion than it is if you're it's the first time someone's becoming aware of you. So in this case, the goal was really to drive ROI for them. And create great content in the process, of course, but it was much more revenue focused. So we worked with a relatively small budget, the right kind of influencers for the brand. The influencers were creating the right kind of content, sharing it out on the right platforms, all through Go-to-Buy, which is, again, a distribution mechanism. So it allows us to track it regardless of whether it's Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, their blog. We get insights into whatever the channel is through which that content is disseminated. And the campaign ran over a few months. Generated over $350,000 in sales for them. The ROI on that's obviously superb and replicable and scalable. Each of the influencers was creating multiple posts. So again, you want to have multiple points of engagement, not just sort of a one-off scenario where it's only in front of their user one time. But they were posting multiple times in different channels. And now we're working with them again to do this on a larger scale to reach a much larger audience. So with that, we can turn it over to questions. Well, so there are different ways to put it together. Our typical campaign involves some kind of an upfront payment to an influencer along with some portion of the sales that result from it and generally gifted product from the brand. So, if we're working with Steve Madden, for example, there's a negotiated price for exactly what it is they're going to do. They're going to get a percentage of the sales that result from the content they've created and shared, and then they're going to get free pair of shoes or whatever the items are that they're going to promote. Yes. The question there was, how do we incentivize influencers to create this content?
So I assume the majority of the ROI was driven by putting heavy money behind the influencer-created content. Am I right? Or how much of it was organic, or how do you look at that picture? Organic reach through influencers versus brands' own money put behind those posts.
Okay. So the question was really, what's the, I guess, percentage of revenue derived from sort of organic traffic from an influencer's end user versus through additional marketing behind that. In this case, we're talking about actually the organic sales component. Typically, we would expect that a larger share will be driven through boosted posts, through additional advertising. But in this case, this was actually organic reach from the content itself. I couldn't hear the end of that. Could you repeat the last part of your question? So the question was, how exactly are we tracking the sales that are coming through at the end? Is that right? So we're using affiliate marketing programs. So we're connected with brands through the various affiliate companies. We do also have our own code that brands can install, although that's an uphill fight to get brands to put anything on their site. And so we're using that to track it. And so whenever anybody clicks on a buy now link, it's a short form URL that goes through our system, and then we dynamically generate tracking code within that so that we can tell what the share channel was, the time, the place, all that additional information you can use to track back to it. And then when they actually make a purchase at the end, we now have that data. Obviously, there's cookies get rewritten all the time, so you're not getting 100% of it, or probably not even all that close to it. But it does allow for much more apples-to-apples comparison. You can't necessarily say, hey, all of these sales, this is all the sales we drove. It's probably actually a lot more than that. There's probably also stuff happening offline. But if you're comparing two influencers who both at least supposedly have 100,000 followers, and one is driving 10,000 in sales and one's driving 50,000 in sales, well, you can tell that one is more effective than the other based on that, because it's a much harder statistic to game. While there are lots and lots of fake followers and bots and things out there, bots don't buy anything. So at the end of the day, if you can actually track sales, you get a much better insight into what happened. Sure.
So you were saying that a lot of the bloggers use a lot of fake information. So how do you vet out like
well, you should always look into their stats and actually check some of their more popular posts. You can probably with a little practice get pretty good at telling when comments are fake or they're bots or they're some kind of artificial means of inflating the engagement. The way we typically do this to try to make sure we deliver well for our clients, but also so that we can continue to grow our base of influencers, is in any given campaign, we try to work with 80–85% influencers with whom we've worked in the past, who we know they are capable of driving sales and delivering things on time, and then 15–20% new people. And within those new people, stuff goes wrong. You find people that you probably don't want to work with again. But the best way to do it is sort of an iterative approach to continue to grow that network and make sure you continue to engage the people who are effective. And when you find people who aren't, you probably don't work with them again. So the question was whether we pay influencers upfront or based on performance. Typically, there is a guaranteed fee that they're going to receive. That's not always the case. There are sort of one-offs, but that's generally how it works. It's usually paid after the campaign is done, once we've verified that they've done everything. Now, there's a little caveat to that, which is that when in doubt, you generally want to pay the influencer anyway. You don't want to piss off somebody who has a large following. It can be bad for your brand. But you probably don't want to engage that person again.
So how, I guess, your solution, how does that streamline that process?
Well, so we automate a lot of the emails going back and forth, and influencers with whom we've worked in the past, we already have negotiated agreements with them, which really streamlines the process. And we're moving towards a bidding system, actually, where brands will be able to say, here's our budget for the campaign, and have the influencers bid on the campaign, so that you're able to create some criteria for the people with whom you want to work. But the whole process is set up to reduce the overall number of emails throughout the process, not just that negotiation process, but also the tracking pieces, confirm that they've received stuff, that they took the pictures they were supposed to, that generally it's been edited or photoshopped or whatever before it's going live, and then even the brand sign off on whether or not it meets their standards, and then the payments pieces. All that stuff is automated, or to the greatest extent possible. There's still parts where a human has to jump in and be involved in that process, but you can cut down on the total emails back and forth by more than 50%.
Those campaigns you showed, pretty amazing ROIs there. As more money flows into this channel, do you see those ROIs going down and costs for action going up?
So the question was whether or not we expect to see, as this becomes a more saturated channel, ROIs decrease. Probably over the long term, yes. In the short term, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, so I wouldn't expect there to be too much of that. And one caveat to that campaign, it did involve sort of around the holiday season to some extent. So that obviously is going to help people. If you look at seasonal sales, it definitely varies throughout the year. So it's much easier to drive sales in Q4 than it is in the rest of the year. But in the short term, no, I would expect ROI to remain excellent. 5 years down the road, once this is a much more saturated channel, it'll probably be typical economics where your ROI starts to approach what you would get from other marketing channels. So the question was, with influencers, do we see more new customers or returning customers? So that sort of gets to what kind of KPIs you want to look for with respect to a campaign. So if we work with a large brand, a lot of the sales are going to end up being return customers, in part because they already have a very large customer base, so there are fewer newer customers for them to engage. With smaller brands, it's going to generally be a lot more newer customers because they're reaching people that aren't aware of them. So that really ties into sort of the brand and how they should approach it. If you're a smaller brand and you're looking to do this, you probably generally want to be a little more long-term oriented and say, hey, I'm probably not going to generate a ton of sales right off the bat. I'll make some, but I'm getting some engagement with that end consumer. And if I continue to do this over some period of time, then those people will start to convert and be actual, hopefully long-term customers of the client. If you're a very big established brand, it's a lot easier to get somebody to buy from you again because they're already familiar. They say, oh, I really like that, I want that, and they can make that impulse purchase right then. Well, they're generally a good. So the question was it because of the holiday season, or were there other factors we can cite? So in that case, the holiday season certainly played a role. Generally, you'll also find, most of the time, there are exceptions to this, but that slightly lower price point items are easier to get someone to buy through an impulse purchase. So a large brand selling a mid to lower mid price point product that's well established in a holiday season is going to drive the absolute best ROI. You're not obviously going to be able to deliver all of those factors every single time. If you're selling during the wrong time of the year, or a brand that no one's ever heard of, or a very expensive product, it's going to be generally more difficult. So it's going to vary on a lot of different factors.
Do you notice anything in terms of U.S. versus international with respect to development or the saturation, as well as strategies that look better or worse?
So the question is whether we see differences between domestic and international in terms of how this is all done and how developed the market is. So our focus tends to be on the U.S. We've done some stuff internationally, but we're a New York-based company. We're relatively new. It's also a much more developed market in a lot of ways. There are a lot of challenges with other markets that are more fragmented. You've got regulatory issues, shipping issues, language issues, all kinds of stuff. Whereas somebody who's especially U.S.-based is going to have typically a US-based English-speaking following in a very large market. So in many ways, it's easier to do here. I do expect to see it evolve a little differently in some of the other markets, but it's probably more advanced in the US. And the UK is pretty far along as well.
Creating content for the influencers. Do you have any guidelines on brands when they're creating
So the question was whether or not we have guidelines for brands in terms of the direction they steer the influencers in content creation. So the biggest guideline actually would be allow the influencer to have some artistic creativity with the content they create. The stuff that's going to resonate the most with their followers is going to be as authentic as possible. It's going to be their style, their brand, which is part of the reason you want to make sure up front that you're getting somebody who's aligned with the brand, because they're going to naturally create the kind of content that's going to engage their user. Beyond that, obviously you want to take into account, hey, if it's a new product launch, you want to feature how it's special, different, variation on something, relaunch of a classic line, whatever. You want to steer them towards that so that sort of you fuse the brand vision with that person's innate creativity to get an end result that's going to resonate with that end user. So it can be a little bit of challenge because you've got people in branding really have they're passionate about their brands and they're very concerned with someone taking liberties with it. So you want to make sure that you handle that challenge to them giving up a little bit of their creative control to the influencer, but while providing the appropriate guidance.
Is there any regulatory or legal requirement that when an influencer is promoting a specific product under a situation provided by their sponsors, that they have to declare that they're being paid to do so?
So the question was whether or not there are regulatory issues around disclosure that something is sponsored, and absolutely there are. A lot of it's grayer than would be ideal. One of the things that we do with our platform to help brands with that, especially larger brands, have gotten in trouble in the past and get slapped with fines. The content that's shared out through our platform is uploaded to the platform and approved first, and so the appropriate hashtags like sponsored are built in before they actually are able to share. So they can't share without doing it that way, and they're also agreeing to the terms and conditions of that, before the campaign even gets started. Generally, they're going to go after the advertiser. That's one of the reasons you want to make sure that the contracts are appropriate up front and that you've got all this stuff, all the best practices built in before you allow this content to go out in the wild. Because in that case, if they go against all the stuff to which they've agreed, it's much easier to say, look, this isn't the brand's fault. The blogger didn't disclose what they were supposed to, and there were all of these safeguards in place for them to do so. It really, the onus is on them. If you don't make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row and then somebody goes and violates it, you are more likely to run into legal issues. Yeah, I mean, we put a lot of safeguards in place to make sure it's very hard for someone to mess it up.
But, because internationally, if you're reaching out to international market, there might be different requirements for different markets. Some will be more relaxed and some will be more strict.
Yeah, our approach is better safe than sorry. So we build probably a little bit of overkill into that process, but the last thing you want to do is run into some kind of regulatory issue down the road, especially if you're a larger brand and someone wants to kind of make an example of you to teach others not to follow that path. So the question was whether or not we limit the number of brands an influencer represents for a specific product. We don't have an explicit limit. We do, however, guide people in the right direction. So what we try to do when we work with influencers is ensure that they're not promoting competing brands or competing products at the same time. We can't place a long-term prohibition on them. 2 years down the road, they're certainly going to do whatever it is they want to do. But we try to work with them to make sure that they're not going to promote, have one post after another where they're featuring two competing brands with competing products, because that's going to sort of muddy the message and reduce the efficacy of the campaigns.
Is it worth having different kinds of affiliation links for every single KOL that you work with, in that they cannot use each other's links and then get that fine? You understand what I mean?
I think so. The question was whether it's worth making sure that there are different links for each influencer, each product, and everything. Well, I can only really speak to how we set this up. The way we do it, literally every single click generates a different link that's trackable. So we pass through additional information so that we know that it wasn't just this influencer drove something. It was through this channel at this time from somebody whose IP address was here. We want to track as much of that as possible. And so literally every single link is different. The question was, how many influencers do we normally have in a campaign? That really can run the gamut. Probably about a dozen would be typical. Certainly it can be as small as just a handful, or it can be dozens. My recommendation would be, especially if it's the first time you're running a campaign, or your first time you're working with a client to run one, you probably want to work on a slightly smaller one, because there are a lot of moving parts. Developing familiarity with the kinds of things that can go wrong is paramount, because there are a lot of the same things go wrong, from one campaign to the next. But there's always something new, and you want to just be as prepared as possible to make things not fall through the cracks. So I was asked to remind you to fill out your feedback forms as well. You can get to them. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Sure. And if you have any additional questions, I'll be outside here for a little bit to answer any of them.